Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell again, and in this next section of our slideshow, part 2, we're going to continue talking about that list that we made in that very first slideshow. We talked about direct impact on organisms, the hunting, overhunting, poaching, and then we made a list of what are some things that humans are doing to impact ecosystems that ultimately impacts the organisms that live there. And one of the first things on our list was agriculture, the practice of farming. If you remember from our last part 1 video, we talked about the idea of humans hunting for food, gathering, using the resources from their environment to collect food, collect berries, fish out of the rivers and lakes, use their hunting to collect animals for meat. And that worked pretty good for a while, but that's kind of a tough way to live, to wander looking for food all the time. Sometimes you go out and you don't catch something. And so it didn't take very long for people to come up with the idea that maybe instead of wandering around looking for food, we could stay in one place and grow that food for ourselves. And so probably since the last ice age, about 11,000 years ago, humans had figured out the idea of farming, growing their own crops, raising animals for their meat, and started doing what we call agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most important developments in history because it led to so many other things that are really important about the society that we live in and the world is the way it's set up. If we figured out the idea of staying put, raising your own crops, it allowed those early people to raise food in large quantities. Instead of going out and hunting and maybe catching something, maybe not, they had the ability to stay in one place, grow their own food, maybe enough not only to get by, but a little extra that could be stored for later. It allowed people to stay in one place instead of moving around so much. And that idea of people living together and staying put led to the development of villages and towns and cities. And if you have a lot of people in a city, you need governments to control things. Somebody has to be in charge. You need laws to protect people, writing, and all of these things that kind of make up the way our civilization is, all are the result of agriculture. Agriculture is pretty important. We talked about the idea of farming, using the land to provide resources for us. But by about the middle of the 20th century, even though we were having all these advances in agriculture, we were growing more food, there were a lot of food shortages, and people around the world, in many parts of the world, were not getting the food that they needed. So there was a big push by governments, countries getting together saying, what can we do about this? We need to figure out some ways to make more food available to people. And there was a big push and a lot of money into research and coming up with new ideas, invention that is going to allow us to increase food production for the people who live on the planet. And it led to something called the Green Revolution. Green as in think green, farming, plants, improvements in our ability to grow food. And it was called the Green Revolution, and it basically consisted of some of the new technologies, the new invention, the new ideas that allowed us to increase food production at that time. One of those ideas was figuring out ways to make new kinds of plants, different strains that maybe produce more food, that grew faster, that grew longer, that were hardier, be able to resist extreme conditions. We're still doing that today. If you look at SDSU nearby, one of the research programs that is going on there is plant breeding and figuring out new kinds of plants that allow farmers to grow plants under different conditions, to make more food, to produce crops and things that are stronger, sturdier, better able to survive. One of the other ideas that was part of this Green Revolution was the creativity and invention that came from coming up with new machinery. If you New farming techniques allowed people to plant larger areas, farm more of the land. If you're pushing a little plow, walking behind, or being pulled by a mule or some kind of an ox, you can't farm a very big area. But if you can have a big machine to help do the harvesting, to help do the planting and the plowing, combines and tractors, those were all inventions that helped farmers grow more food. And the invention of chemicals to help the farmers. Fertilizers, pesticides were invented that boosted crop production, controlled the pests that were eating the crops, and allowed farmers to grow more food and to protect the food that they were growing from the insects and the pests that were eating their crops. So the idea of growing more, having the ability, the machinery, the techniques to grow more food, what we figured out is the best way to do that is to do something called monoculture. Remember that prefix mono means one. Growing one kind of plant in a huge area allowed the farmers to be more efficient. They had the machinery to able to handle more area like that. And it's way more efficient if you just have to get out one kind of machine to do one kind of technique, plant 1,000,000 acres of corn all side by side, and year after year you're planting the same thing. If you drive on any country road in South Dakota, you're going to see miles and miles of corn, miles and miles of soybeans. If you've ever flown in an airplane and looked down at the Midwest, it looks like a quilt, like a patchwork. Lots of areas of all corn all together year after year, or all soybeans. We call that monoculture. The problem with monoculture, and monoculture is a really good way to grow a lot of food, but to do monoculture required farmers to use a lot of those chemicals that were invented at that time. Pesticides to kill the pests, the bugs that were eating the crops, and fertilizer to help the plants grow. Pesticides, the problem with doing monoculture and using these chemicals is they end up in places that we don't really want them. Pesticides kill not only the harmful insects that are eating the crops, but all insects, even the beneficial insects. Remember we talked about interactions in ecosystems, and there are organisms that eat other organisms. They keep the population in check. And for example, one of the pests we have in South Dakota are aphids, and the bugs in an ecosystem that would eat those aphids are ladybugs. Ladybugs are predators, and they hunt and kill and eat aphids. So when you spray pesticides, not only does it kill the aphids, it kills also the beneficial insects like the ladybugs, and that impacts the ecosystem, those food chains, those interactions. The beneficial insects are not there to take out other kinds of bad pest organisms. And runoff from feedlots, if you put a lot of cows together in one place, you're going to have a lot of manure. Runoff from fields, from chemicals in fertilizers and pesticides in the fields can run off. We talked about water cycle and runoff. In the spring, when there's water, those things are going to end up in the surface water, end up in the groundwater. So monoculture allows us to grow a lot more food, but there are some consequences to the ecosystem. The other impact of agriculture is the way that we farm, the way that we plow. One of the ways when you're doing monoculture to grow corn is you plant your seed, the corn grows at the end of the season, at the end of the summer, in the fall. The farmers go in, they harvest the corn, cut down the corn stalks, and you've seen that little stubble, the roots and the leftovers of what's left in the field after the corn has been cut. We call it stubble, or like all those little pieces that are left. And what the farmers would do is, after they harvested the corn, they would come through and plow that all under, leave bare soil exposed during the winter time. And when the rains come in the spring, it leads to a lot of erosion. There's no roots, there's no plants. They're anchoring that soil and keeping it in place. And the way we have been farming leads to a lot of soil erosion. Comes from plowing the land and removing those plant roots that are holding the soil in place. The other problem with agriculture is moving water from one place to another. Well, agriculture requires a lot of irrigation and watering, and if you're taking water from one place to put it somewhere else, we're causing lots and lots of areas to change from fertile, rich soil, good for growing, into deserty, dry places that can't grow anything. It's called desertification, and we're seeing that over and over. Places that used to be able to grow crops, due to farming practices, due to drought, due to overgrazing, no longer able to grow the food that we need. The other thing about growing crops is they need a lot of water. Farming often requires using those freshwater resources that we have and irrigating to water and keep the crops going. Right now there's a huge drought going on in the western United States. Not enough fresh water, not enough. There are states that are in legal battles right now of who is going to control the water, and farmers want it for their fields. The lake people and the recreation people want it to stay in the lakes or the rivers so we can have boating and vacation places, and there's a big fight going on about how are we going to divide up our water in the Colorado River. And a lot of that water use is coming from farmers needing that water for irrigation. So where does the water come from that we irrigate? It comes from underneath the soil, what we call groundwater. Water is stored in it's not, we call them aquifers. It's not like a big lake under the ground where there's a huge just kind of container or bowl full of water, but it's all that little water that's in between the crevices and in the cracks and in between the rocks and the soil and the water underneath the surface of the land. Is called an aquifer. And if you look at the central United States, we call that the breadbasket. That's where we're growing most of our food. All those states, starting, you can see South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, all those places where we're growing the food for the world are using water to irrigate coming from those aquifers. And the main aquifer that's closest to us is the Ogallala Aquifer. It's named for a Native American tribe. You can see it's parts of South Dakota run all the way down to Texas, and this is underground water that's fresh water stored underneath the surface. And the problem is that because of our usage of that water, we're using up our groundwater, our aquifer water, faster than the water cycle can replace it. There are other aquifers besides this underneath other parts of our country. In all of those aquifers, we are taking out the water faster than it can be replaced by that water cycle. Remember, we talked about water being a renewable but not an unlimited resource. What scientists say is that from how much we estimate the water that's down there in the Ogallala Aquifer and how fast we're using it up for irrigation, for farming, some cities get their groundwater from that aquifer. They're saying within 20 to 40 years, that's in your lifetime, that aquifer is going to run dry. We're using it up faster than the water cycle can replace it, and that's a serious problem. We're going to have to solve how are we going to grow the food that we need to feed the people on the planet, especially if we add another 2 billion people in your lifetime. Grow enough food, but still protect our environment and make it so that we are not harming the ecosystems. So how do we do that? How do we help? How do we fix this? There are ways that farmers can farm using techniques and using ideas that make it more healthy for the ecosystem. Technology kind of got us into this mess with all of our use of fossil fuels and all our gadgets. But technology is also changing how farmers farm and changing the impact that farming has on ecosystems. How many of you have a GPS in your cell phone or in your car? It's pretty common now. And think about that technology, the idea of using satellites and GPS, not only for finding your closest Starbucks or finding your way when you get lost, but putting that technology in the hands of farmers, putting a GPS into a tractor. We have satellite technology. There's satellites called Landsat that are orbiting our planet constantly, not the communication satellites that are sending your cell phone signals or your satellite dish pictures, videos, but there are satellites that are orbiting the planet and taking pictures. They orbit constantly. They're covering the planet. There's a whole series of them, and they are sending images back to the land, back to our country, and in fact back to South Dakota. If you've ever been on the road going down to Sioux Falls, you go right past that sign that says Eros Data Center. Eros Data Center is the receiver for all of those satellite pictures from all over the world are coming to South Dakota. How amazing is that? They have a huge computer system down there, and they have been collecting satellite images from every place on the planet for years and years and years. And what that GPS allows farmers to do, amazingly, those satellites can take pictures of the land and tell the farmers where are the plants healthy, where do we need to put some fertilizer, where are the bugs eating the crops, and allows that farmer to drive his tractor with his GPS to the exact spot. And if you, instead of spraying fertilizer everywhere because you don't really know where you need it, the farmer can just spray one little area that maybe needs fertilizer, or instead of putting pesticides everywhere, the GPS, the satellites can tell the farmer, just spray in this area here, here's where the corn rootworms are. It allows farmers to use that technology, and they can farm without using the chemicals, as many chemicals. They don't have to put fertilizer everywhere. They don't have to put pesticides everywhere. They can let the satellites tell them where they need to go, and actually drives the tractor to that spot and knows when to start spraying, when to stop spraying. It's pretty cool. Another example of how farming can change with just a simple idea is doing something called no-till. Remember we talked about the idea of farmers at the end of the season plowing under the leftover stubble, the corn stalks that are left, and then leaving that ground open, that soil bare all through the winter, and leading to erosion problems. So the idea was, what if we didn't do that? What if we didn't plow it under? What if we left that stubble, that leftovers from after the harvest, we left it in place all winter? And instead of tilling it, instead of plowing it under, we leave it in place. It anchors the soil, prevents erosion, holds the nutrients in place. And then in the spring, the next year, when we're ready to plant, then we can plow it under and plant our seeds. And all of those nutrients that are left over, our decomposers can break those down, put them back into the soil, and provide nutrients, less fertilizer needed. How cool is that? And we have protected our soil by anchoring it with those roots all winter and through the spring, and now that those leftovers are there to provide food for the new plants that grow. It's called no-till. You can tell which farmers are doing it. If you drive down a country road and you see bare soil in the wintertime, you know they're not doing the no-till thing. If you see that stubble left, it reduces erosion, protects ecosystems, holds the nutrients there. It's a pretty cool way, and it doesn't really cost the farmer anything. In fact, it makes it less expensive because he can get away with using less fertilizer. You're providing your own fertilizer by using the leftovers to break down and provide nutrients for the new seeds that are growing. It's a pretty cool idea. We just need to educate people of how to do this and why to do this. It's good for the ecosystem. It's good for the farmers. Other ways that farmers are changing the way that they farm so that we can protect the environment a little bit. Putting in cover crops, plants that recycle and put nutrients back into the soil. We talked about legumes in our last chapter. We talked about those cycles, and nitrogen cycle, and we have those nitrogen-fixing bacteria that hang out in symbiosis with the roots of legume plants. They're actually putting nutrients back into the soil for the plants. It reduces the need for fertilizer. Planting legumes, we call those cover crops, actually puts fertilizer into the soil. It saves the farmer from having to add fertilizer, add those chemicals. We can control grazing, when we graze, how long we graze, keeping the pastures from wearing down to nothing and taking all the grass. The way we plow can make a difference. Instead of plowing with the slope of the hill, we plow against the hill, and it makes it so the water doesn't run off and cause erosion. It helps to hold the water in place on hilly places where we're planting crops. Crop rotation, alternating between a plant that needs fertilizer like corn with something like alfalfa that returns, it's a legume, it returns the nutrients to the soil, and that means next year you need less fertilizer. We talked about the idea of good bugs, biological pest control, having bugs that allow you to kill the pests without using chemicals. If you look at the bug lab north of town here, some of you may have heard of that. It's a USDA research facility. They are doing research on how can we grow crops without using pesticides. How can we use natural pest eaters like ladybugs to eat the aphids and stop the use of so many pesticides in our ecosystem. Farmers can call up and order a box of ladybugs to be delivered and let those loose in the field and take care of their aphid problem rather than putting pesticides down. There's lots of things that farmers can do. We just need to educate the people to help them to see that this is going to be good not only for farming, helping us to grow food, but also good for the planet. Okay, the next big thing that happened, in addition to the green revolution of being able to grow more food, was something called the Industrial Revolution. You may have talked about that or learned about that in history class. During the 1800s, there was a big push to move to cities, move off the farms, move into a city, get a job in a factory maybe. There were factories that are hiring people, were building new things, all these new inventions, automobiles, electric lights, indoor plumbing, all these cool things were being invented, and we had people moving to the cities now, and the cities were growing bigger and bigger, and it led to some problems with our ecosystems. We have had lots of invention. Think about all the cool modern conveniences we have. Big rigs, pickup trucks, Humvees, computers, cell phones, all the electronic gadgets that we play games with, video games. Those inventions have provided us with a pretty amazing, comfortable lifestyle that we have today. But having those things and relying so much on the fossil fuel that's needed to power these things and create our electricity and drive our cars has had a serious impact on ecosystems. So we need to have a look a little bit at how cities and urban growth, modern technology has had an impact on ecosystems on our planet. One of the things you have to do when you cut down make room for cities is you have to cut down green places. And we talked a little bit about deforestation in our last slideshow. We're cutting down trees, not only rainforests to make room for agriculture and raise more cows, more cattle for the beef industry, for fast food restaurants in the United States, but anytime you are building a city bigger, you're taking out green places, and that involves cutting down trees. We can see this in the satellite pictures. Remember I said those satellites are orbiting, and they've been taking pictures back at our planet for years and years. And the cool thing about that is they go over the same places over and over again. And so you have a before and after picture. You can look at a picture, a satellite image of a city, and 30 years later you can compare how has the city grown? How much bigger is it? This is a picture of the Brazilian rainforest, and this is kind of a before and the after picture. 30 years apart. Look how much all this gray is city. That's concrete, that's roads, that's buildings. And you can see how much the city has grown and taken over green places. Tropical rainforests used to cover more than 14% of our total Earth's surface. We are now down to half of that, less than half of that. Less than 6% of our planet now is covered by rainforest. That's an amazing chunk of green that has disappeared from our planet. Tropical rainforests are disappearing, they say, at a rate of about 80 acres per minute. That is really fast. And remember, if you take down the forest, the animals and plants that live there are going to be severely impacted by that loss of habitat. Nearly half of the world's species of plants and animals and other microorganisms will be destroyed or severely threatened over the next quarter century because of cutting down our rainforest. So how do we fix this? Remember, I said not to focus on all of the bad things that we've been doing, but what can we do better? How can we make this better? We have to stop clear cutting the forest. We have to stop cutting down our rainforest. They're disappearing too fast. So instead of taking the whole forest, selective harvest. If you need wood for building, don't take the whole forest down. You pick the mature trees, you select trees, you cut those, and leave the rest to maintain the ecosystem. Replanting logged areas. If you are a business that's taking down trees in the United States, you have to replant them. You have to replace them. You can't just move in and log and take out all of the trees. We need to think about replacing those trees that we have been losing. We have tree farms to grow trees, to make them so that they can be transplanted and returned to the ecosystem. Scientists breeding and coming up with new strains, new kinds of trees, faster growing, producing better, faster organisms. There's lots of things that we can do to help keep our forests and keep them from being taken down. If you think about that idea of developing cities and taking away green space, we are destroying habitats. Every time you put a parking lot in, a shopping center, houses, buildings, we are taking away green space and the organisms that live in that place. So it leads us to this idea of building, not so we're totally taking out green, but something called habitat fragmentation. Taking a green place and splitting it into smaller, remember, fragments, little pieces. If you look at this green area, we still have lots of green, but there's a big superhighway now going through the middle of this green place. It's been broken into smaller pieces. It results in little islands of green interrupted by concrete, humans. And so instead of like totally paving over everything, this fragmentation leads to breaking up the ecosystem. It brings wildlife in contact with the humans. The wildlife still are going to go about their business. They're going to go to the places where they usually go for food. Only now they may have to encounter humans, cars, in that process of getting to the food supply, finding where they need to migrate to. And the little cartoon kind of makes a joke of it, but this little bunny is going across the road to get dinner, and what are the odds he's going to make it across that 6-lane highway without becoming roadkill? When it comes down to wildlife coming in contact with a car or a motor vehicle, a truck, the wildlife is going to be the loser. And if it's us or them, it's the them that usually loses. And it comes from breaking up the habitat into smaller little pieces by running roads through the middle. We're going to stop right there. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned to the next slideshow, part 3, for more of biodiversity threats.